3 months before the world was told that Lucian Vale had died in a rented mansion at the edge of a canyon, he stood on a private balcony overlooking a film set and said something to a sound engineer that the engineer did not think much of at the time and has not been able to stop thinking about since. He said, according to the engineer's later testimony in a documentary that aired years after Vale's death, that there were people around him who wanted the show to happen more than they wanted him to survive it, and that if anything happened to him before the curtain rose on opening night, the engineer should remember that Vale had said those words exactly in that order, on that balcony, on that afternoon. This video is about that statement and about a pattern of similar statements, warnings, and behaviors that Vale exhibited in the final months of his life. Behaviors that at the time were largely dismissed as the paranoids, exhaustion of a man under enormous pressure, and that in hindsight, to a growing community of researchers who have spent over a decade combing through every available recording, deposition, and secondhand account, look like something closer to a man trying, in the only ways still available to him, to leave a trail of breadcrumbs for whoever might come looking later. We are not asking you to accept any of this as proven fact. We are asking you to listen to what the people who were actually there said he told them, in his own words, as closely as the record allows us to reconstruct them, and to decide for yourself what those words add up to. The first documented warning came nearly a year before his death, during a deposition connected to an unrelated contract dispute, a deposition that has only become publicly available through court record requests, filed long after Vale's death, made the underlying case a matter of renewed public interest. Under oath, in response to a fairly routine question about his financial advisors, Vales gave an answer that the attorneys in the room apparently found strange enough that 2 of them later mentioned it independently in their own recollections of the case. He said that he had begun keeping a private record, separate from his official business files, of every financial decision made on his behalf in the preceding 18 months because he had, in his words, stopped being entirely certain that the people managing his affairs were managing them in his interest rather than their own. When the opposing attorney asked him to clarify what he meant, Vale reportedly smiled, according to one account, and said only that some things were better explained later by someone other than himself, should the need ever arise. That phrase, someone other than himself, is the detail that researchers keep returning to. It implies, on its most literal reading, an awareness that he might not be available to explain something in person when the explanation eventually became necessary. Skeptics point out, with some justification, that a man embroiled in years of litigation and surrounded by people he had genuine reason to distrust might say something like this, purely out of ordinary caution, the kind of statement any person under legal and financial siege might make without it indicating any specific premonition of death. Believers in the larger pattern argue that, taken alone, the statement means very little, but taken alongside everything else, Vale said, and did in his final year, it becomes part of something considerably harder to dismiss as coincidence. The second piece of the pattern involves a private record that Vale is alleged to have kept, the one referenced in that deposition, which has never been recovered in its entirety, but portions of which have surfaced over the years, through sources that range from credible to highly questionable. The most widely cited fragment, authenticated by a forensic document examiner hired by a journalist investigating the case nearly a decade after Vale's death, is a single handwritten page found among materials sold at an estate auction. Materials that the auction house later admitted had been improperly cataloged and released without full verification of their provenance. The page, in handwriting that the examiner judged consistent with known samples of Vale's writing, with what the examiner described as moderate to high confidence, lists 6 names without context, followed by a single sentence. These are the people who benefit most if the tour never finishes the way it is supposed to. No public explanation has ever definitively connected those 6 names to anything specific. 3 of the names belong to individuals involved in the financial structuring of his final tour, people whose business relationships with Vale are matters of public record, and whose interests in the production's outcome were, in the most charitable reading, simply the ordinary financial interests of anyone with money invested in a major entertainment production. The other 3 names have never been satisfactorily identified at all, leading to years of speculation within researcher communities about who they might have been and why Vale considered them relevant enough to write down. The third element of the pattern is the one that has generated the most public attention, partly because it involves something concrete enough to be examined directly. A series of phone calls Vale is documented as having made to his eldest child in the final 6 weeks of his life, calls that the child, years later, described in a single carefully worded public statement as different in tone from anything her father had said to her before. She did not elaborate extensively and has consistently declined further interviews on the subject, but the statement she did make included one specific detail that has never left the public conversation around her father's death. She said that in the last of these calls, made 4 days before he died, he told her that if anything seemed unusual about how things played out in the coming weeks, she should trust her own instincts over whatever she was told by people standing close to the situation, and that he loved her, and that he was sorry for things she would understand eventually, but did not need to understand yet. This is, by any honest accounting, an extraordinarily ambiguous statement. A man under the kind of stress Vale was under, a man whose own physician would later be convicted in connection with his death, a man whose finances were genuinely in crisis, might say something exactly like this to a beloved child purely out of generalized anxiety, guilt over decisions he had made in his life, or simple paternal instinct to offer comfort and caution without any specific knowledge of what was coming. There is nothing in the statement that requires it to be read as a warning about a staged death, a financial conspiracy, or anything beyond the ordinary worries of a complicated man near the end of a difficult chapter in his life. And yet the specificity of trust your own instincts over whatever you are told by people standing close to the situation has struck many who have studied this case as a strange thing to say to a child, unless the speaker anticipated, in some form, that the people standing close to the situation might later tell her something he did not want her to simply accept without question. The fourth and final piece of the documented pattern, and the one that has resurfaced most recently in connection with the photograph discussed in earlier research into this case, involves the property purchase made 18 months before Vale's death through the layered shell company structure that researchers have spent years attempting to trace. What has not been previously widely reported is the timing of that purchase relative to the deposition mentioned earlier. Court records show the property was acquired only 11 days after Vale gave that sworn testimony about keeping a private record of his financial dealings, a sequence that, on its own, proves nothing about intent, but that researchers studying the full timeline find difficult to dismiss as purely coincidental given everything that followed. It is worth pausing here to give full and fair weight to the case against all of this meaning anything at all, because that case is genuinely strong and deserves to be stated plainly rather than waved away. Lucian Vale was, by every credible medical account that has ever been produced, a man in serious physical decline in his final year, dependent on a cocktail of prescription, sedatives that his own physician would later be held criminally responsible for administering improperly. People in declining health, under financial and legal pressure, surrounded by relationships they have genuine reason to question, frequently say things that sound ominous in hindsight without those things reflecting any actual knowledge of a specific plot or plan. Vague statements about distrust, private records that may have contained nothing more than the ordinary anxieties of a man reviewing his own finances, a final phone call to a daughter that could just as easily reflect a father's generalized guilt and worry as any specific foreknowledge. None of this constitutes evidence in any legal or scientific sense. The official record of his death, established through a criminal trial, an autopsy, and toxicology results that independent experts have reviewed and found consistent, remains the only account of what happened that has actually been tested through a formal evidentiary process, and it has held up to that testing. There's also a psychological dimension to this story that deserves honest attention before we go any further, because it cuts in both directions at once. Researchers who study how conspiracy narratives form around the deaths of major public figures have noted a consistent pattern across decades of cases entirely unrelated to Vale. The pattern goes roughly like this. A figure whose public identity was built around an unusual degree of control, secrecy, and carefully managed mystique dies suddenly in the public, having spent years or decades being told only what that figure wanted them to know, finds itself unable to fully trust the final official explanation, precisely because every previous explanation they received about that person's life had also been managed, curated, and incomplete by design. In other words, the very skill that made Vale such an extraordinary performer, his lifelong ability to control exactly what the public believed about him, may be the same quality that makes it almost impossible for some portion of that public to ever fully accept any official account of his death, regardless of how strong the formal evidence actually is. This does not mean the staged death theory is true. It means the conditions that produce belief in theories like this one were present in Vale's life long before his death ever occurred, built deliberately, performance by performance, year after year, by the man himself. The financial advisors named in the surfaced fragment of Vale's private notes have, over the years, responded to public scrutiny in markedly different ways, and those differences are themselves part of what keeps this story alive in research circles. Two of the three identifiable names cooperated at various points with journalists and documentary producers investigating Vale's final months, offering detailed and largely consistent accounts of a man under financial strain, but in full command of his business decisions, accounts that directly contradict any suggestion that they viewed him as someone whose death would have served their interests. The third name has never spoken publicly about the matter in any format, declining every interview request across more than a decade, a silence that skeptics characterize as entirely ordinary professional discretion around a sensitive and litigated matter, and that believers in the broader pattern characterize as conspicuous given how forthcoming the other two names were by comparison. What makes this entire case so difficult to resolve, even after 11 years, and an enormous volume of research from people on every side of the question, is that almost every individual piece of evidence is genuinely ambiguous on its own terms, capable of supporting either the most mundane explanation or the most elaborate one, depending entirely on what the observer already believes going in. The deposition could be ordinary legal caution or quiet foreknowledge. The handwritten page could be a man processing anxiety on paper or a deliberate record meant to survive him. The phone call to his daughter could be generalized fatherly worry or a specific warning delivered in the only coded language available to a man who could not say more directly what he feared. None of these pieces, alone, tips the scale definitively in either direction. It is only when they are placed beside one another in sequence that they begin to take on the shape of something that feels, to many who have studied it closely, like more than coincidence, even though every individual researcher who has reached that conclusion would readily admit, if pressed, that they cannot point to a single piece of hard proof that would hold up in the same courtroom that convicted his physician. But the official record, however well it has held up, was never designed to answer a different question than the one it actually addresses. The trial determined how Vail died, medically and legally, on the specific night in question. It was never asked to determine, and could not have determined, whether the events leading up to that night unfolded entirely as they appeared to, or whether a man who had spent decades mastering the art of controlling every detail of his own public narrative might have spent his final months trying, in fragments scattered across depositions, handwritten notes, and a single difficult phone call to his daughter, to ensure that some version of the truth, whatever that truth actually was, would eventually surface even if he was not present to deliver it himself. That is the warning, if it is a warning at all. Not a single dramatic revelation, not a hidden message in a song lyric or a coded gesture caught on camera, but a quiet, persistent pattern of a man telling the people closest to him, in small and scattered ways, to keep their eyes open after he was gone, to trust their own instincts over convenient explanations, and to remember that some things were better explained later by someone other than himself. 11 years on, the people who knew him best are divided about what any of this means. Some dismiss it entirely as the understandable anxiety of a dying man being misread by people desperate to find meaning in a tragedy that was, in the end, exactly as simple and as sad as it appeared. Others believe that Lucian Vail, a man who spent his entire life building and controlling a mythology so complete that even those closest to him struggled to separate the performer from the person, understood something in his final year that he could not say directly, and chose instead to leave a trail, fragmented and ambiguous enough to survive scrutiny, clear enough that someone, eventually, might follow it all the way to wherever it actually leads. We are not telling you which of those two stories is true. We are telling you what he said, as closely as the record allows it to be reconstructed, and we are leaving the rest, exactly as he apparently intended, for you to work out for yourself.